OpTic, though, we have to talk about them because that was so. Boston has competed well against many teams in the past. Last year, we talked about on the last pod. I think I said they had 12 Game 5 losses, and I think they were 2-12. So 14 matches went to Game 5s. That's a lot, but in the end, they lost most of them. Well, Boston goes to Game 5 as they are accustomed to do, and they go to Game 5 in the first match, or their first match of the new CDL season against OpTic, and they beat OpTic in Game 5. They win both search and destroys in this series, 12-5 round count between those two S&Ds. Boston also won the second hard point in the series. OpTic won the opening hard point, just a slaughter in the first map. They win the control to go up 2-1, and then they end up losing this series. Again, we can't overreact. We can't say, "Oh my God, the defending world champions, they're chalk. They, get rid of them, break up the team, or anything." But what do you make of that result? And obviously, they did have a win later in the weekend. So, but what do you make of that result in particular against Boston?
I mean, that's just just a massive shock, right? It's literally the team that won champs against the 12th place team, and the 12th place team from last year wins. Obviously, a different roster than that 12th place team for Boston, but um, yeah, totally unexpected on my end. I think just about anybody will tell you that they were not expecting Boston to beat OpTic. I think there's some rumors floating around about Shots either being sick or having pink eye, and I think I saw a clip of like Scump saying that Shotzi left his controller in the bathroom at the hex quarters or whatever, and Scump's like, I'm not touching that thing. So there might be some, illness or whatever going on in their OpTic, not making excuses or anything. I think Boston played pretty well, all things considered, and that's like kind of just an opportunity. Like I've talked about it on this podcast before. Like you don't want to play against a really good team to start off the season, yada yada. But like to play devil's advocate to that point, I make so much time when you're in a situation like this for Boston, 12th place against first place from the previous year. Like you have nothing to lose. Like I said, almost everyone is expecting them to lose, so they go out there, they get to play free. Worst case scenario, they lose, and that's what everyone was expecting, right? So maybe that had something to do with it. They were just, they went in with an effort mentality and just doing what they want to do and played free and loose, and that might have, helped them out in the long run. But yeah, definitely unexpected result overall. It was pretty funny. Obviously, the flank is live right now, so I didn't get to uh, hear what Aches had to say about OpTic's follow-up performance, but I know Aches brought up the old "is Shotzi a superstar" conversation in the episode after OpTic lost to the Boston, because he said a superstar should never lose to a 12th place team from the previous year. I thought it was pretty funny that he brought that back up, and obviously that's like kind of you were saying with FaZe. I can't put too much stock into just a couple matches, and let alone just the first match of the year. But yeah, definitely was not expecting to be talking about Boston upsetting OpTic on this podcast at all. There was no universe where I ever was picking Boston to win that. No universe where I was thinking it was possible, but here we are.
Well, that superstar stuff has to go out the window after the second series that OpTic had, because today on Sunday they play Cloud9. Shotzi was like the best player in the world during that series. 1.87 KD. For the weekend, he had the highest KD of any player in the CDL with a 1.43. He was like, if he had pink eye, like he needs to get pink eye every single weekend. Like there's no chance that that guy should be that good. He really wasn't the problem this weekend, and he wasn't dropping like huge numbers last season, which is kind of the reason that the superstar stuff came up. Was back when he was with the Dallas Empire, it was like, well, Shotzi's the guy, he's the go-to slayer, and he really hasn't been relied upon in that role to that extent, at least. But this weekend he was. It was really Kenny. Like his stats really, as you can expect, were not up to par, and he didn't play well in some of those maps. But still, to lose to Boston, they look like two completely different teams. I don't know what that is about OpTic, because that is kind of a trend with them over the years, that like last season we even saw that before champs. They looked like one of the worst teams in the CDL, and then they get to land, and then they are literally the best team in the world, and they win champs. I'm not sure why that is, but it has definitely become a trend for OpTic. And I mean, if you can win the last match, then it doesn't really matter, I guess. But Boston, like let's keep it on this team for right now. Boston, they beat OpTic, obviously, so that's a great win. That's already, I think they're already 20% toward their season total from last season, which feels ridiculous to say, but I think they only had 5 wins last season, so they're almost a fifth of the way there. But they already now have 2 Game 5s under their belt as well. They beat OpTic in the first Game 5, and then the second Game 5, they lose to, I believe, Vancouver. Lost to Minnesota, and they lose in round 11, which just feels cruel to get the breach that close. What did you think of Boston this weekend in this roster, which we definitely did not give a lot of hype to or a lot of credit to, because a lot of these guys are trying to prove themselves, at least at this point in their careers. So what did you make of the breach this weekend?
Side note, Juan Soto just signed with the Mets for $765 million. So, but yeah.
I didn't see any fire, so it didn't really happen.
So with Boston, I mean, I know we definitely like rated them lowly and stuff, but I know at least once I said it and brought up the notion that this team played better at the Esports World Cup than the previous Boston roster that competed for them throughout the whole CDL and all of its iterations. That's really not like a lofty,
Low
achievement
bar.
or low bar. So I know we've talked about it really, but like they definitely coming into this weekend, just beating OpTic alone is, enough to say like, hey, yeah, this team maybe has a lot more potential than the previous roster. Again, not saying too much. But then you go into the second match where they're competitive once again, and not necessarily against a team of the same caliber of OpTic in Minnesota, even though Minnesota had a really good start to the season here. But to see that, like, this wasn't like a previous Boston team where they went into a match and it's just a total letdown. They just got smoked and it was over. Like, Boston was competitive and they were hanging around, and literally, like you said, a round 11, Game 5 round 11 away from us having a conversation, them being 2-0 after the first week of the 2025 season. So, really an impressive showing. I mean, you could go down the list for all the guys. Snoopy had, played pretty well. Awake and Purge had moments. I think Purge played better in Search, if I remember correctly. Just trying to think of the stats off the top of my head. But like, yeah, that's interesting that's how the season starts for Boston. And it's kind of like, where do they go from here, right? Like, if they start losing, is it, it's just the same old Boston? Or if they keep winning or, remain competitive, it's like, okay, yeah, things have changed. Like, is Snoopy developing? Is, Cammy back? Treyarch title, MVP Cammy, is he back? Big Wake, is he back? Is this the real Purge after his rookie year where, kind of bounced around, didn't have the strongest debut? Like, it's, again, we don't have too much of a sample size, and well, I guess technically with 2 matches we have the largest sample size possible for Boston, but nonetheless, it's just interesting that this is where the conversation sits around Boston right now, because if it was last year, probably just a different tone, and I mean, we might not even be talking about Boston. There sometimes we just skip over Boston matches, like, yeah, Boston got 3 out, and that's the end of the story. But I think even as we're going through these matches and these teams, like, I don't want to skip ahead too much, but even a team like Vegas that, a lot of people were not having high expectations for, they were competitive and arguably more competitive than some teams or some pundits might have thought. So, could be a result of the game, which, that's been a case in the past, but it could also just be that, the skill gap or whatever is closing, and some of these guys are, the talent is rising. We're cutting down, the number of pro players is as low as it's ever been, just because there's no expansion still, and
Mm-hmm.
we added the team with Vegas, so there's less North American players in the league than ever before. So it's like, is this like just going to be the year where we see the most talent on display? And maybe that's the case, and it's where you have teams like Boston, who weren't great last year, putting up strong performances against a team like OpTic that literally won champs. So I don't know. I don't want to babble too much on it, but again, like you said, small sample size, only 2 matches, but definitely an encouraging start for Boston.
Something that we might have overlooked, and not saying necessarily you and me, but just kind of like the scene as a whole. Something we might have overlooked is the fact that these 4 players, speaking for Boston, they have to be as hungry as ever to prove themselves and prove that they are worthy to be on CDL teams. Each of these 4 players have been doubted to a considerable extent, probably, and have been out of the CDL at some point or on the verge of being out of the CDL. Snoopy, I think, is the only one at this point who hasn't been down to challengers in the last year or so, but he has been maligned to the extent that people are calling for him to be demoted to challengers. So I think that might be an underrated part of Boston, is that they all have something to prove, and they have something to prove together. And maybe that will kind of galvanize them and be able to be enough to kind of get them by. And another part is they all have CDL experience, and that CDL experience might be, a little bit, Purge doesn't have as much as Cammy, for example, but Purge did have valuable experience last season with Vegas, and they won matches when he was in the lineup, even though he was also pretty maligned during that period as well. So I just think it's a really interesting team. Obviously, I'm kind of pulling for Boston because you never want to see a team be in last place consistently, unless it's like, Vegas or something where that they're not putting in as much effort in terms of like the behind the scenes stuff. But like Boston, granted, all their behind the scenes stuff is in question now, but before then I never questioned their commitment to Call of Duty. And I hope that these guys, especially considering all of them were on the edge of the CDL and challengers, they're, if they succeed, they can kind of stick around, and they're all young guys to a certain extent. So, I think it'd be cool if they were able to be competitive on a consistent basis, but I guess we'll see.